Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the first round of the 2025 NHL entry draft for the San Jose Sharks. For the third straight year, the Sharks had 2 picks in the first round, the first of which being their own, the second overall selection, which they earned when they lost out actually on both draft lotteries, one to the New York Islanders, who would leapfrog them and grab the first overall pick, which they would use on Matthew Schaefer, but another to the Utah Mammoth. Thankfully, however, for the Sharks, the Mammoth were 14th in the draft rankings, and you can only move up a maximum of 10 spots. So Utah would end up picking 4th overall, and the Sharks would retain the second overall selection by default. This was the benefit of finishing dead last in the standings the previous season. On top of this, the Sharks also had the 30th overall pick acquired from the Dallas Stars in the Mikael Granlund trade this past season. So a pick early on in the first round and another one late in the first round. We'll start off with that second overall selection. Back at the time when the Sharks got it at the lottery, it seemed very obvious who San Jose would end up drafting. It was basically going to be Matthew Schaefer if the Islanders went with a forward at number 1, or they'd pick up the best forward available, which at the time the consensus was quite clearly Michael Misa. And indeed, in the weeks post-draft lottery, it still continued to be pretty obvious that the Sharks would try to take Misa. There were the small possibilities of like a trade occurring, or maybe they'd go completely off the board and grab Porter Martone, but these were also very low percentage chances. It felt as though Michael Misa was the Sharks player. That was until the few days leading up to the draft. Just recently, a rumor began to pop up that instead at number 2, the Sharks were looking to take Anton Frondell. And if this was just a completely unsubstantiated rumor, I really wouldn't have paid it much attention. However, it began to get picked up by a lot of big name insiders and public scouts, to the point where in some of the mock drafts right before the draft occurred, many people did indeed have Anton Frondell going at number 2 to San Jose, which was in stark contrast to the previous season where there was absolutely no drama, no hesitation. Even Mike Greer himself was very open about the fact that the Sharks were going to be taking Macklin Celebrini at number 1. This time around, there were some very real nerves about who the Sharks would end up selecting with that second pick, and it was further exacerbated by the fact that the NHL decided to go for a decentralized draft this season. None of the executives or general managers were in attendance, and it was supposed to create like this smoother draft that would move along much faster, but instead it went the exact opposite direction, where this was one of the longest first rounds we have had in a while. And one of the first big pauses was after the Islanders picked Matthew Schaefer at number 1. There were multiple minutes before finally the Sharks selection was announced. But indeed, after many nerve-wracking moments, they decide to go with who many people thought would be the obvious choice for so long, Michael Misa at number 2. And this was just an absolute home run, slam dunk, whatever sport analogy you would want to use. Michael Misa indeed was the best forward in the draft. Just absurd numbers put up in the OHL this season, over 2 points per game, over 60 goals being scored. He has success in every possible area. He's a great goal scorer. He's a great playmaker. He moves across the ice exceptionally well. Great skater, can take faceoffs. He plays the penalty kill. He plays the power play. He can drive plays, he can drive the middle of the ice, he can be that two-way guy as well. Basically, a lot of the qualities that Macklin Celebrini has as well, just maybe at a bit of a lower type of level. But Michael Misa was viewed as just such an easy selection because he perhaps has the highest floor out of any player in this year's draft. Maybe there's a chance he doesn't become the next superstar in the NHL, but you're likely getting, at the very least, a very good NHL player. And this further adds to an already extremely deep forward prospect pool that the Sharks have. It's not an optimal situation, which is why the Sharks would have taken Matthew Schaefer if they had the number 1 overall pick, but you gotta go with best player available, and indeed, Michael Misa seemed to be that guy. Now the Sharks, they've got before Celebrini and Will Smith as their 1-2 punch at center. Now Michael Misa is added to that. Obviously, you're not going to have any of these 3 players play the third line center position, so one of them will have to flex to the wing. That seems most likely to end up being Will Smith, simply because he played the wing the majority of this past season, but of course, you never know. But at the end of the day, you can never have too many centers. It is a premium position in the NHL. Some of the best teams in the league have exceptionally good center depth. Just take a look at the Florida Panthers, who won the Stanley Cup in each of these past couple of seasons. They have one of the best number 1 centers in the league at Alexander Barkov. Great two-way player, an elite second-line center as well, at least in the playoffs when it comes to Sam Bennett, and one of the best third-line centers as well when it comes to Anton Lundell. The Sharks, as I said, probably not any of those players are going to end up playing 3C, but they can kind of mirror that aspect that the Panthers have managed to dominate teams thanks to that type of depth that they have. So a great pick at number 2. There were definitely some hesitations here, but it's nice to see that the Sharks go with that consensus choice. Then we had a significant gap before the Sharks would end up picking again at 30. Like I said, this was not a smooth draft at all. Many hours ended up passing between the first and the second pick that the Sharks would make. But what was interesting, actually, was that there was a small storyline that began to develop in these middle picks, which is that Victor Eklund was, of course, on the board here, and there is a connection there to the San Jose Sharks because the Sharks have his brother, his older brother, William Eklund, who they took at 7th overall back in 2021. And there was always that kind of pipe dream here that the Sharks would be able to grab his brother and try to reunite that type of duo. However, it seemed as though at the time that Victor Eklund might be like a top 10 selection, and it is not easy, especially in this draft, to be able to trade into that top 10. But Eklund was actually falling down the draft board. He was available at 11, he was available at 12, and in particular, when it comes to that 12th overall pick, there was actually a trade announced, and I even had for a second thinking that perhaps the Sharks had traded up for that 12th pick to grab Victor Eklund. It didn't end up being the case. I believe it was the Philadelphia Flyers who went in that direction instead, but Eklund would go all the way down to 16th before being drafted by the Islanders. But every single moment, it felt as though perhaps the Sharks could trade up. It would have been very cool, very fun to see that actually happen, but I definitely don't really blame Mike Grier for not pulling the trigger. As I already mentioned earlier on, the Sharks had great forward depth before adding Misa, and now with him there, it is just probably the best forward prospect group in the entire NHL by a decent margin. You don't also now have to add Victor Eklund to it. Instead, the Sharks trying to focus in other areas that they could improve in. So they hold on to all of their draft capital, all of their players, no trade ends up getting made, and that brings us to that 30th overall selection. At the time here, I had predicted that the Sharks would try to pick up a right-handed defenseman, or perhaps even a couple of right-handed defensemen, because this is the biggest need that the Sharks have in their prospect pool. And interestingly enough, at number 30, there was one still on the board, Henry Brustevich. This was a player who I expected to be there, but another who was also still on the board was actually Blake Fiddler. I thought he'd probably end up going in the mid to high 20s, that there would be no chance that the Sharks could pick him up at that 30th overall pick, but he was still there. And so the Sharks seemed to have a choice between two solid right-handed defensemen, but did not pick either of them. Instead, they surprised everybody by grabbing a goaltender. Joshua Ravensbergen ended up being the selection for themselves. And this was seemingly quite crazy because the Sharks, they don't really need forwards, but you can never have too many. But they definitely didn't really seem to need a goaltender, because right now, leading the way within the Sharks prospect pool is, of course, Yaroslav Askarov, who's only 23 years of age. It seems as though he is the future starter for this franchise for many, many years at this point. And so adding another young goaltender to the prospect pool, it didn't necessarily fit in exceptionally well. But I imagine the idea here from Mike Grier is to have simply drafted best player available. This is not a goaltender who was just viewed as like a third round pick that the Sharks have reached incredibly deeply to try and pick up. This was a player who many people believe to be perhaps the best goaltender in the draft, definitely a first round selection, and perhaps could have gone much earlier on in the early 20s, maybe even the late teens. So it is a possibility here that Mike Grier had Ravensbergen very high up on his draft list and felt the need to pick him up at the 30th overall pick, just because you try to pick up the most amount of talent. Just because you draft a player doesn't mean they need to stick around and remain with your team for the next 20 years. There is always the possibility of a trade occurring. Just look at what the Nashville Predators did with Yaroslav Askarov. They took him even though they had UC Saros as clearly their future starter, and indeed that's exactly what happened. So they traded away Askarov, and they got for themselves a first-round pick and a former first-round pick as well. That is some pretty good value. So if the Sharks have a ton of faith in Ravensbergen to become a great goaltender and solid goaltending prospect right now, this is always a player who the Sharks could look to move out within the next couple of years to bring in some maybe NHL-ready talent or some futures or whatever the case may be. So I don't necessarily blame Mike Grier for going for this player if he truly believed he was that best player on the board still. On top of that, the Sharks also still had the 33rd overall pick, the first pick of the second round. And as I mentioned, both Brustevich and Fiddler were still on the board. One of these two right-handed defensemen, technically both of them could have gotten picked before the Sharks had the chance at number 33 if the Kings at 31 took one and then the Calgary Flames at 32 took the other. But while Brustevich did end up getting drafted by the Kings with that 33rd 31st overall selection. It was Fiddler who got passed on in the first round here, and surprisingly is still available in the second round, which makes me believe this is a pretty no-brainer selection for the Sharks. Last year, they were able to get Igor Chernyshov with their early second-round pick, which seemed like a huge steal because he was projected to go mid-first round, and it seems as though history is playing itself out yet again with another mid to sort of early 20s first-round pick still being available at number 33 that the Sharks could be able to grab. Now, of course, Mike Grier could surprise us yet again by going in a completely different direction, but considering just how desperately the Sharks do need some right-handed defenseman help, I cannot possibly imagine them yet again passing on this type of player. So I would imagine Fiddler ends up being that selection. We'll see what ends up happening tomorrow, but when it comes to their first-round picks, obviously, Michael Misa was the obvious choice that we kind of strayed away from a little bit in the days leading up to it, but nice to see it indeed end up happening. He's going to be fantastic for the San Jose Sharks. And then Joshua Ravensbergen as well, more of a project player, being a goaltender who usually takes longer to develop, but if there's a lot of faith in him to become something here in the NHL, whether that ends up being with the Sharks or a completely different team that the Sharks could potentially trade him to, it looks like there is a lot of value there. I would say the thing that I should finish on here is whether or not Michael Misa, when it goes back to that second overall pick, could end up being a player playing with the Sharks as soon as next season, because I mentioned he perhaps has the highest floor out of any player drafted this season. I would also say he probably has the highest odds of actually making it to the NHL, which is strange because usually you would expect the first overall pick to have the highest odds, but Matthew Schaefer's in this weird situation where he didn't really play a lot of games this past season. He is also a defenseman, which take a little bit longer to develop, and he's also one of the youngest players of this draft, so it seems very possible that he ends up heading back to juniors next year. On the other hand here, when it comes to Michael Misa, because he is rather developed, as I mentioned, kind of like a Macklin Celebrini type of player, there's a chance he could make it to the NHL this next season. However, it is a bit of a complicated situation. Michael Misa did play in the OHL this past season, but the rumors are that he would be looking to play in college going into next year in the NCAA, and the rules about playing in college hockey is you cannot have a professional contract. And to play in, let's say, preseason games and to get like your 9-game stretch before your entry-level contract would cost a year, you actually have to have an NHL contract. So if Misa signs a deal, he can't go play in college. And if he doesn't sign a deal, he maybe isn't going to get as much of a look as he would have liked. So it's kind of a strange situation going into these next couple of months. We'll at the very least have development camp, which we expect Michael Misa to be a full participant in, and that could give us a good glimpse of whether or not he is fully ready to make that jump to the NHL. Not a great glimpse because development camp isn't really high stakes, but we'll see what ends up happening. I would hope and maybe even suspect that he can make that jump to the NHL. But as we know, Mike Grier is rather patient when it comes to his prospects, so I also wouldn't be that surprised if he does take a year to cook maybe a bit in college with, I believe it is Boston University or Boston College, one of those two, that he was theorized to end up joining, and we'll see him maybe as soon as next year. Class dismissed.